Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this EIC webinar on green data. My name is Matthew Farrow, and I'm Director here at EIC. And as many of you probably know, EIC is the leading UK trade association for the broad environmental sector. So our members are a big mix of consultancies, technology firms, contractors, operational firms, ranging from SMEs to large multinationals. One of the issues they all have in common is a growing interest in environmental data. And environmental data, as we're all aware, is playing an increasingly bigger role in how we understand environmental issues, how we legislate and make policy to address environmental concerns, and how companies offer business services in the environmental field to their customers and clients. So for the past 3 years, we've been working closely with the Natural Environment Research Council to improve the dialogue and discussion between the private sector and the environmental sector in particular, and the broad government and academic sector, which has a huge interest in these issues as well. In previous years, we've ended the year with a major one-day conference bringing together colleagues from across those different sectors. But for obvious reasons this year, we're doing it as a series of 3 webinars over the winter. And today we're kicking off with a webinar on the impact of COVID itself on the way that environmental data is being used and thought about, and how we're trying to join up some of the environmental protection and health protection issues. So really interesting topic. Just before we kick off, a couple of housekeeping issues you can see on the screen. So after our speakers, we're going to have some questions and discussion. And if you want to post a question, which you can do anonymously, please use the chat function to do that. We'll answer as many as we can in the webinar, and any of those we don't get to, we'll come back to you afterwards with a response. If you have missed things in the webinar or you want to see it again, we'll post a recording of it on our website. So thank you very much for attending. What I'm going to do now is hand over to Simon Gardner, who's the Head of Digital Environment at the NERC, so he can say a few words. Simon.
Yeah, thanks, Matthew. And it's a pleasure to see so many people taking part in this webinar, and that we've got a great lineup of speakers at our disposal over the next hour. So I'm just going to start by painting a picture of the journey that NERC's been through during the pandemic over the last 9 months. And so really the first thing I just wanted to say is that historically, as we're sort of reminded continually, pandemics have acted as cultural or agents of cultural change through the centuries. Although what we're living through at the moment feels highly unusual from the perspective of our own lifetimes, human history has been punctuated by these events. And I think one thing that distinguishes the COVID-19 pandemic from some of the others is that it really has acted as a digital catalyst, and in that sense impacted on the way that we manage our data, and particularly our environmental data. So some of the key changes I wanted to highlight to our ways of working in 2020, and this is from a UKRI and particularly a NERC perspective, is that we've had to become more agile and less bureaucratic in terms of our funding frameworks, and the need to deliver those at greater pace. There have been far more multidisciplinary conversations which have occurred, and also an increased convergence of digital research infrastructure. There's been a reduced or reduced barriers to sharing data, so a willingness to work towards a common purpose, and also far greater prototyping and testing of ideas at the developmental stage. And just to highlight a few examples of that very briefly before we move on to our main speakers. Obviously at a UKRI level, the organisation quickly mobilised in order to put funding in place.
So, Simon, are you able to go full screen on the slides? There's a lot of good information there, is it?
Sorry, I've got them full screen on my screen.
Okay.
So
Just looks like there's some good detail there. Might be a little hard for people to see.
Yeah, I'm in danger. I think if I press the wrong button,
they all disappear.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, no, apologies for that, Matthew, if it's not full screen. So yeah, all of this material will be made available after the webinar, but really the graphic on the left-hand side just illustrates some of the various areas that have been funded through this COVID framework, and some examples from a NERC perspective on the right-hand side here. So we've been looking at things like the link between COVID-19 and air quality, looking at the impact of COVID on reduced air traffic and greenhouse gas emissions. We've been looking at how accurately we may be able to forecast COVID through looking at seasonality and the environmental responses, and also looking at the development of UK-wide systems for detecting coronavirus in wastewater. There's been a huge amount of activity in this area over the last 9 months, and more specifically in terms of some of the work that the digital environment team within NERC have been undertaking. We had a digital sprint series earlier in the year, which was linked to 4 successive hackathons, which looked at a variety of areas, including air quality, green recovery, ecosystem services, and the visualization of risk. And this really ushered in an experiment in terms of light touch ways of working and a reduced amount of bureaucracy wrapped around some of the research, looking at how we could more effectively tackle this virus. So that's all I really wanted to highlight in my brief introduction, and hopefully it will give you a sense of some of the impacts at a UKRI and NERC level of the current pandemic. So I'll hand over back to you, Matthew.
Thank you, Simon. So our next speaker is very much at the heart of the government's response in terms of data and COVID. Dr. Andrew Engley is head of data at the Joint Biosecurity Centre. So Andrew, very interested in what you have to say.
Thank you, and just hoping everybody can see my screen. I can't see you, so yes. we'll just check. Good, yeah. Terrific. Thanks ever so much. Actually, that was a great introduction from Simon, and we have been working with NERC through the pandemic. And I will, in fact, just pick up on one of the last things that he showed on his slide, which was wastewater monitoring to detect COVID-19. But to just give you a quick overview of who we are at JBC, what we do, and then get straight into the heart of the matter, which is how we are using environmental monitoring to help us combat the pandemic spread. So JBC is part of NHS Test and Trace. So we are considered to be the data and analytics side of Test and Trace. We provide assessment and insights to the CMO, ministers, local public health authorities, and it's the data and insights that we produce that underpin things like, for example, lockdowns, which I know were very much on people's minds and in the news. I direct the Innovation and Partnerships Hub, and inside the Innovation and Partnerships Hub, we seek to identify innovative opportunities, key partnerships to enhance those insights. And one of our core areas of activity has actually been in the field of environmental monitoring. So my key takeaways from today are going to be we can use environmental monitoring for community health protection, and that's rapidly emerging as a core tool in the COVID-19 response. Secondly, COVID-19 can be detected, as you probably all know, in both air, through aerosols, and in wastewater through fecal shedding. So we've been doing a lot of work in that area and developing a lot of data and insights into how that can help us combat the pandemic. And then I'll just get on to showing you very fast the case study of wastewater and show how we can use wastewater as a supportive data set for assessing geographical variants for coronavirus prevalence. So in general, the research themes that we have been developing in our Innovation and Partnerships Hub are around epidemiology, phylogenomics, quantification, detection of SARS-CoV-2. And then we're also already thinking beyond COVID-19. So what durable infrastructure and data insights will we take beyond the pandemic that will help us improve societal and health outcomes beyond COVID, and also thinking about people, society, and behavior. And what I thought I'd do in the few minutes that are allotted to me is just show in practice how that is working in the case of wastewater surveillance. And so I think, a core observation is that prior to COVID-19, in general, and I understand this is not exactly true, but in general, one could say that we tended to look at the relationship between environment and health as being, are there threats in the environment? For example, nitrous dioxide levels in air quality that can affect human beings and have an impact on health. But actually what we have found through the COVID pandemic is that viral threats themselves, so fragments of COVID, RNA fragments of COVID can be detected in the environment, and thus through environmental monitoring, we can get some relatively unobtrusive community level measures that are helping us do things like map prevalence. So I'll just quickly look at wastewater-based epidemiology as one of those areas. So as an introduction, we can detect viral fragments of COVID-19 through fecal shedding in wastewater. And we can find that, so that's expressed through the number of gene copies per liter that we detect in wastewater samples. I don't have time to go through the whole methodology here, but ultimately we're doing the same kind of qPCR tests that are done on individual samples to detect wastewater in samples that are collected through the sewer system and in catchment areas. We're beginning to look at genomics and phylogenomics, and a very promising area of research for us is actually looking at the spread of viral strains in wastewater. And again, that can give us all sorts of insights, including, as we begin to roll out vaccines, the potential for viral mutations that might mitigate the effect of vaccines. So very promising area of research for us. So at an operational level, what would that look like? We locate sites for sampling, so we sample either at wastewater catchment plants or in sewer systems. We install samplers, we collect and bottle samples, and then we courier those samples to labs. We obviously have a lot of protocols around maintaining lab consistency, lab quality. That's one of the big challenges that we face. And then obviously share those results and transfer the data. And those data are now being fed into some of the core COVID insights dashboards, such as the Cabinet Office dashboard, the COVID-0 dashboard, so on and so forth. And actually, they're being fed directly into number 10 at this point. We do have some caveats for using the data, and these data are around things like flow characteristics. So, for example, environmental conditions, such as whether it's raining or not, whether it's hot or not, can affect both the rate and the quantity of fecal matter that gets absorbed in the sewer system and then gets picked up in our sampling. And we're very particularly interested in building out our modeling of the effect of rainwater on our ability to get consistent normalization across the data that we are collecting. Data processing at the moment, this is a fairly manual process. So going back to that operational diagram that I showed you, there's all sorts of bits in there that require human intervention. So actually taking the samples themselves, getting those off to the labs, there's a courier process involved. All of that introduces time delays. The interesting part for us in wastewater sampling is that fecal shedding, detecting viral fragments in fecal shedding actually begins in the first 24 hours of acquiring the virus. Whereas you probably know that symptoms don't tend to show up, average 2 to 4 days, and people may not go and seek PCR tests until day 4, day 5. of viral acquisition. So the interesting part for us is, can wastewater actually give us insights into spread of the virus at a community level prior to people's engaging with the healthcare services or with test and trace more generally? That's all slowed down if we have that human element in there, which brings me on to the third part on this slide, which is technology. And an area that we're very interested in working with groups such as yourselves and the industry more generally is, can we develop second generation or even third generation technology, things that might look like smart manholes or samplers that can actually then do the testing in situ, which will cut down the time to generating the kind of data insights that we need. And I think the last part on this in terms of technology that's not on this slide is that all of this is most powerful when it's knitted together by a strong data informatics network. And ultimately, we think that there's quite a strong role for AI to play around this. You know, for example, looking at the influences of rainfall on time to detection, but mapping that across a network where we're monitoring UK-wide, for us, that'll be very powerful. So I'm going to end my slideshow right there. But for me, the excitement of working with groups like yours is, I think that we are turning that relationship between, as I say, not looking at the environment as a potential threat, but we're looking at the environment as a place where we can detect the health of the population, monitor the health of the population, and ultimately generate really powerful insights. I'll leave you with the last teaser. So what insights might we get out of this in the future? In the beyond COVID, we're super excited about the fact that a network like this, picking up both COVID, but flu and norovirus and other pathogens, that we might be able to, for example, predict healthcare demand and be able to optimize the deployment of healthcare service provision in the NHS. So those are the sorts of things we're interested in. Really, really grateful for the chance to come and talk to you today.
That's great. Thank you very much, Andrew. Really, really interesting. So we're now going to hear some perspectives from the private sector. And first up, we have Nigel Jones, who is Managing Director of consultancy Extrium. Nigel, over to you. You're on mute, Nigel.
Okay, can you hear me okay?
Yes, I can hear you now, yeah.
And you can see the full screen, I hope, as well.
Yes, looks good, thank you.
Right. So I'm going to talk about noise modelling and health analysis, noise health analysis. Extrium's been involved in a lot of the national noise mapping work that's been undertaken across the UK over the last 15 years. And we're currently leading a project with Public Health England, developing a noise burden of disease calculator to work at a national level and also at local levels as well. So just to summarise noise modelling, it follows the traditional source pathway receptor conceptual risk model that we see in other environmental disciplines. The data is sourced for road, rail, industry and aviation across the UK. And you can see there are a variety of different data types that are required. It's the 3D modelling environment that's produced. So noise is propagated through a 3D environment with reflections of buildings, with noise barriers included. There's soft and absorbent ground features included as well. And also meteorology being introduced into the latest calculation methods. Receptor assessments are typically undertaken well, the primary output is a grid at the moment, but it can be assigned to buildings, and population could be assigned to buildings as well to generate a primary exposure assessment model. Once these data are created for the output of the noise modelling, then further secondary analysis is typically undertaken. We'll talk about health today, but it can also include economic analysis, noise action planning, land use planning, transport planning, and also when working with government, there's a number of issues, for example, parliamentary questions need responding to, and also what if analysis for policy development. In terms of data providers, I wanted to talk about the nature of the data that we have to use for noise modelling, and how it's really effectively a chain of information that flows through a variety of sectors. The underpinning data starts off with transport information. So here, focusing on road and rail sources in particular, we can see that there's a number of transport authorities that we need to require data from. Issues such as traffic flow, assets, condition, road surface type. That's obtained for roads and also for railways. That's then collated typically by the environmental sector. Noise is seen as typically an environmental issue. So the environmental authorities have to source data from the transport sector. They then collate it according to the various environmental modelling criteria and methods that have to be followed. This then is incorporated into the 3D world alongside, so for example, EA LiDAR data. They've got ground surface cover from CEH. Obviously, it's built typically on an Ordnance Survey-based platform, and potentially data is provided from commercial data partners that data has to be sourced from as well to supplement the core model. The outputs are then assigned to, as I said, to buildings and linked with population data. So again, census information is brought in. And then when those results are created, as data is created, data is then passed on through to the health authorities, who then are looking to undertake burden of disease calculations. The point to take from this is really the complexity of working across, from a government perspective, working across different sectors with different cultures, different objectives, different priorities. Noise has a challenge in that it's a secondary pollutant from a primary activity. So we're always depending on information from the transport sectors to feed our models that create the noise assessments. And it's quite critical, especially from a health perspective, to understand this chain of data flow through these organisations to ensure that the appropriate source data has been captured to help support the health analysis. And that really the key to this is digital project planning with agreements and appropriate data standards underpinning the process. And here is an example of the work. This is the English, effectively a data flow diagram showing the data sets that are used in the England noise mapping work over the last 8 years. Now, this is, to point out, this is used for one primary purpose or one use requirement, which was European reporting. That's obviously potentially changing at the moment. And there's now a much greater number of users that now want to start using this data. So it looks like there's going to be a much greater increase in the amount of data being fed into this process. Because of the nature of the use for the modelling to date, the maps have been created using national data sets, but with an increasing health interest looking at lower noise exposure levels, not just considering noise adjacent to the trunk road network or the primary routes, but going to, for example, B roads and unclassified roads. It requires data from an increasing number of highways authorities. So a much greater increase in data inputs are predicted going forward. So this is actually quite a simple diagram compared to what we're expecting in years to come. So in terms of what COVID-19 has shown us and how does this relate to noise? Well, a number of areas. One of the ones is the need for standardized access to authoritative local data. I think we've seen with the number 10 briefings, the graphs and the charts showing traffic flow. Well, we know there's been an issue with noise for a number of years about being able to obtain detailed, accurate traffic information from local authorities on a standardized platform. And we think, well, we understand that COVID has gone quite a long way towards trying to address this issue. So that's something we look forward to working with the results of that work. Also, the importance of a common evidence base between national and local authorities. Again, an issue for noise and other disciplines like air quality. Trying to get data harmonisation across the two tiers has been a traditional challenge. And again, we're aware that that's an issue with COVID. And again, there's an opportunity of trying to use COVID as a catalyst for improvement in that area. Also, the need for a greater level of detail in modelling. Environmental modelling for noise tends to focus on daily averages or annual averages. But again, there's an increasing demand for more intelligent analysis at with different diurnal patterns, looking at, say, for example, rush hour periods or different classes of vehicle and how they contribute to the overall noise level. So a much greater level of detail required, and also greater levels of accuracy and a speed of analysis. Accuracy in terms of being able to obtain marginal gains and improvements in noise environments, and also speed of analysis. The noise maps of around 15 years ago were taken a year to calculate. It was a very slow computation process. It's a very heavy calculation environment. Nowadays, we've got it down to a number of weeks to cover the country. But again, the focus now is looking at high performance computing and again, artificial intelligence to try to produce much faster responses in terms of policy answers to questions that are required. So all this throws up a number of challenges, but also some opportunities. And just to sort of summarize thoughts on this, the first one is really the man who's dealing with managing data between authorities. There's been a traditional issue with national and local government having a bit of a disconnect in data that we use in noise modelling and other environmental disciplines. And we see this providing an opportunity to really start to look at fixing that issue. So between national and local government, but also between user communities, such as noise, air quality, and climate and emissions modelers, a lot of them are doing the same type of analysis. We're all trying to produce transport models from which we derive an understanding of pollutants or costs associated with those input data. There's also an issue with different levels of detail in applications, with an increasing number of end uses. I think it's throwing a question up about whether we can produce all answers from one model, or whether we perhaps need different types of data, different levels of modelling for different applications. Noise is really focused on one requirement to date, but there's an increasing amount of end uses that are now being requested. So the need to start to think about data standards, how we structure our data, how we have a structured thinking about how we share data and organise data in what is an increasingly complex data ecosystem is a real challenge for the community. And finally, I think as most of these projects find, they're complex. They're incredibly complex projects to manage. There's a need, I think, possibly in our sector for culture change, looking at greater dialogue between organisations, incredibly complex amount of data flowing between organisations potentially, to getting agreements on data standards between organisations is really quite key. And that ultimately comes down to the importance of vision and leadership in understanding how this process works. So that's really my thoughts. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Nigel. And obviously that issue of fragmentation of data and the sort of siloed nature of it is a fundamental challenge. So next speaker is Sarah Pyatt. Sarah is a GIS leader at Mott MacDonald. Sarah, over to you.
Thank you, Matthew. Hi, I'm Sarah Pyatt. I work within the Environment Division here at Mott MacDonald, leading the GIS team. I mainly work on environmental impact assessments for infrastructure projects and sort of managing data between multidisciplinary teams. Today, as we're approaching the end of 2020, just wanted to take the chance to reflect back on not only where this year's gone, but also what lessons we can learn from the challenges that we faced, and looking forward as well to how we can recover from them. So this pandemic has really highlighted the importance and need for information to help provide insights into the sort of complex and ever-changing problems that we face, and making the right decisions in order to address them. For us to determine what the solutions need to be to help us recover, we must first obviously understand what the challenges are that we face, and ask the right questions in order to help us do that. The only way we can really get a holistic understanding of what these challenges are is by bringing data together. If data remains siloed and inaccessible, we cannot see the bigger picture. But by integrating the data, we can obviously analyse it, measure it, and monitor it to see any patterns and trends as they emerge. We see this obviously, the need for this when we are looking to build infrastructure that benefits both the environment and the society that we live in, including recovering from this pandemic. We need to ensure that environmental and social data is part of the whole design development process right from the beginning and throughout the operational maintenance of an asset as well. We need to access and provide the data in a digital, usable way to ensure that it has most benefit. And the integration of sort of environmental data and BIM on infrastructure projects has been a sort of key topic of conversation for many years now. Technology, awareness and skills are all continually improving to help us tackle this challenge and bring that data together in a usable way to help us provide the insights that we need. One key way that we can bring this data together is through location. And being a GIS consultant, this is where my main experience and interests lie. This year, the Geospatial Commission published the UK Geospatial Strategy, which looks at opportunities of utilising geospatial data in the UK, as well as reflecting on the impact that COVID-19 has had on how we use that data. In the strategy, it states that location data will be the unifying connection between things, system, people, and the environment. And leading on, they then look at the possibilities of what we can do when the data is integrated. This pandemic has also highlighted the importance and need for information, but not just the availability of the data itself, but also the importance of good quality and useful data. Data is valuable, and we need to know and understand this value in order to manage it correctly and make best use of it. If we don't understand the data, it has limited value, or it could even be a risk if the decisions are made based on bad data. So we need to provide the specialists that do understand the data with the tools and access that they need in order to harness the full potential value. Looking at some of the other trends in environmental data that have continued to emerge throughout this pandemic, we can see that the way we collect data has also had to change. Earth observation data is becoming more available, more varied, and at higher resolutions than ever before, and is hugely beneficial for providing near real-time data. It can be used at a range of scales, from satellite imagery to local and targeted capture through the use of drones. And this data is useful not only for monitoring and environmental change, but also for providing insight and information for planning and policy. It's not only the way we collect data that has changed, but also how we share and communicate it. We have not been able to have face-to-face meetings or consultations this year, but even before that, we saw a shift towards remote engagement and communicating more digitally. Discussions and examples have continued on the topic of digital impact assessments in terms of how we collect, manage, and analyse our data, but also how we report and share that information afterwards. We still understand the need, of course, for and the importance of a narrative, but by combining that with the interactive and engaging technologies that we have access to, we can really start to harness the benefits and value of this information. Thank you all very much for listening, and wishing you all the best for 2021.
Great, thank you, Sarah. And our final speaker is Kevin Turpin. Kevin is a technical director at Jacobs. Kevin, over to you.
Is that sharing?
Yes, it is. Yeah, we can see this.
Can you see my screen? Sorry, if I put it onto. Is that okay? You can see that?
Yes, we can see it. I don't know if under display settings at the top, you might be able to make it full screen, but not to worry.
I think I'm in the same situation. Shall I carry on?
Okay. Yeah, don't worry if you can't. To say we will make the slides available afterwards and the recording. So yeah.
Okay. Okay, so as I said, I am the technical director at Jacobs, and I deal mainly with clean air zones. More recently, major road schemes, low emission strategies, for example, but principally is about understanding emissions and their propagation and their dispersion from road sources. And I think when it comes to big data,
camera on, Kevin, as well. No reason.
Sorry,
you want to turn your camera on as well? So.
Oh, okay.
No reason to be shy.
Just trying to find the camera. Ooh,
Start video down the bottom.
Yeah, I'm not finding the.
Okay, don't worry if not.
Don't worry. Start video, there it is. I got it. So one of the articles that came out, which I read recently, was in the battle against air pollution, big data is winning. Well, I'm not so sure. I'm not so sure, because I think one of the big issues to do with data and data generally is about connectivity, and whether we have cities or we have various applications which are connected enough in order to bring forward any of those data streams that we would find useful in terms of air quality. So I suppose this presentation is more about looking at from the bottom up in sort of a case study, just to understand what sort of data and challenges we have in order to find those solutions. So in terms of sources of data, those sources of data tend to be mobile phones. In terms of when we talk about big data or green data, we talk about mobile phones, parking bay sensors, traffic junction flow measurements coming from various applications on the roadside, smart cars and their connectivity. We can use CCTV for various streaming CCTV images. But of course, all these things are great in principle, but there's a lot of challenges to do with these types of data. One is, and as the previous presentation mentioned, a lot of the air quality work we do, environmental work we do, a lot of the data has got to be spatially resolved. Whether or not indeed those sources are either open or paid data sources. Again, that's a challenge if you have to buy the data. And then, of course, there's a lot of pre-processing of that data to get it into the required format for us to use as air quality practitioners. And then, of course, we do a hell of a lot of checking of data to make sure the integrity of the data is sound, which takes time. And then we have to then transform that data into metrics to use, for example, dispersion models or emissions models. So there's a lot of work. It doesn't naturally come down the line and it just gets magically used. And I think there's also maybe there's an idea that a lot of machine learning could be involved. I mean, I would agree to a certain extent, but that machine learning then it gets used to adapt those metrics in a particular way, or perhaps resolve that data in a particular way to provide some answers for us, which leads me to my next slide. Is about one of the problems we have is that the question's quite important. Before we go on a mission to try to use big data in a particular way, we've got to be clear about the question which is being asked. And so it's all very well having loads and loads of data, but you don't want to go down the road of trying to crunch this stuff up if you haven't got a direction. So, and there is this. I think there's also this idea again about whether AI or whether machine learning manifests solutions for us. I would probably beg to differ on that front. I do agree that there is a role for machine learning, but again, it's got to be directed in the beginning by sort of understanding what the questions are, and then there's that proportionality issue about trying to use big data to a sledgehammer to crack a nut sort of problem. Because of the sheer cost and scale involved in getting these types of data utilized. So, and there's also the confounding factors which confound air quality management. Generally, COVID was an opportunity which allowed us to see what if, for example, which was quite interesting from an air quality practitioner. So we do understand, or there is an understanding of what types of data we can use for data analysis, both upstream and downstream. This is quite a good example or a way of trying to understand the interactions between different metrics And for example, wind speed in this example for NO2, we know that when you get higher wind speed, NO2 tends to decrease owing to the greater dispersion. And equally, we know that in the presence of ozone is limited. So as NO2 starts mopping up some of the ozone, then the ozone then starts decreasing. And so these relationships you can get from real-time data, and you can start looking for these paired these correlations between different parameters, which is a useful aspect of perhaps say machine learning or AI to start mining in to various data sources. So in terms of COVID, if you've got access to real-time data, and which a lot of cities have, but only in limited locations. Big cities may have 4 real-time monitors. We are starting to get those lower cost sensors, mesh sensors, which are being installed into cities. But at the moment, there is a fairly limited amount of information we could gather. But by gathering real-time information, we can use open air sources, which allow us to take out the seasonality or the variation of the weather, how the weather influences emissions over the year. By taking out that seasonality, we're then able to focus on what the effects of COVID actually meant across major cities or urban areas. This is a typical type of output you'd see from most sites in most urban areas, I would imagine. And this is showing the pre-COVID and then the social distancing and then the lockdown phase followed by post-lockdown. And as you can see, during post-lockdown, we're starting to see emissions creeping up again. Clearly in this slide, we're not quite back to where we were before, but there is there is a view that if things are to progress as the trends and trajectories as we're seeing at the moment, we think that there is a high likelihood, even though there is a lot less people traveling at the moment. But this does rely on having a lot of real-time data and tools to enable us to crunch that data and in such a way to answer a particular question. So my final slide is to say, well, okay, we've got big data, but what sort of sources, what data sources are used at the moment in order to monitor a typical, I'd say a typical junction type air quality issue? And on this slide, I've put in, and this is an actual situation where we are closely monitoring a traffic situation. But at the moment, we've got the passive diffusion tubes, which are recorded and changed every month. We've got a mixture of low-cost sensors which have gone in, of which there are 6, so we could get a feel of the trend of the emission response to roadside. We've got Q surveys which have gone in as well, because we know there is a particular problem on this direction and this road direction on this particular carriageway. We've got ANPR cameras that are telling us something about what the fleet is doing in terms of upgrading to newer vehicle models and emission standards. And we've got one continuous analyzer, which is a reference device, which can then calibrate the rest of the air quality monitoring devices. So I suppose the question I'm asking is there scope for big data to improve our understanding of this particular junction? At the moment, I don't think so. The only type of data that we could possibly use perhaps is mobile phone data, but that doesn't give you the spatial resolution that we need to identify specific issues to do with turning movements and to do with queues. So I think I think what we need to do is look at the data sources we've got at the moment, that real-time data, and in the example I showed you on the other slide, to maybe look in and investigate trends a bit more using tools being developed to answer specific questions, and then I think there is definitely an area where we can optimize our existing data sources much better, and I think open air is one particular code which I think a lot of practitioners will be looking into in the future. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kevin. Some good challenges there. So if I could ask the speakers to turn their webcams on, and also thank them all for sticking very much to time. So we've got about 15 minutes or so for questions. If you have a question, do use the chat function and do post your question there, and we'll try and pick it up. But let me kick off with sort of perhaps posing one of the issues which Nigel raised, posing that to our public sector speakers, Simon and Andrew. I mean, Nigel made the sort of very good point that there's just too much fragmentation in terms of data sources, different organizations, a lack of integration between national level data and sort of local authority data. I guess, Andrew, perhaps sort of starting with yourself, obviously the urgency of the COVID situation, I guess, has led to a lot of breaking down of barriers in terms of the work that yourselves and the Joint Biosecurity Centre are doing. What's your take on, I mean, has that been the case, I guess, and also how do you think we can try and make sure this is one of the lasting sort of impacts of what we're going through at the moment?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question, and certainly something that's on everybody's minds. I would say candidly that in the early days of the pandemic, we all found ourselves in a situation where there were more barriers than we would otherwise have wanted. And so in fact, the outcome certainly in the early days of the pandemic was actually a fragmentation rather than a consolidation of the data space, certainly across government. And so, you know, paradoxically, that's actually put us possibly in a situation where we're going to have to come from further behind in terms of data unification. There's a lot of work going on. I can't discuss it all, but there's a lot of joint initiatives between bodies like HDR UK, ONS. There's a lot of discussions about the integrated data platform, which is a government initiative that was funded under this current budget to create a joined up space for data. But I think the other part of it is that we all recognize that there's a lot of problems in terms of data governance. And so possibly it's not a technical problem, it's more of a governance problem, and governance then brings us on to public trust. So the place that I always end up when people ask me this question is, well, you know, before we can think about any better joining up of data, we're going to have to think about the public's willingness to share those data with us and public trust. And I will say that one of the fears that I've had out of some of the pandemic and the pandemic response is that the public seem increasingly skeptical about data sharing. So I think we've got a long road to go, but I would put the stress more on data governance and public consent rather than thinking about it in technical terms or even agreements between data custodians.
Okay. Simon, have you got thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think I'd agree exactly with what Andrew was saying around data governance and public consent, and particularly how we combine the environmental data with health information, for example, is still quite a significant challenge. You know, in the environmental space, we're used to very different levels of rigor compared to, you know, the world of the sort of shared research service and personalized or depersonalized health information. How we can bridge between those two archives is an ongoing, very much an ongoing challenge.
So there's questions come through from the sort of attendees about this sort of interoperability point, and the question is, what do panelists think is the most efficient route to make data truly interoperable? Is it on the one hand building the data to a specific use case, or is it alternatively overarching development of data using specific technologies? So this question, I guess, is it a technology issue or not? That's to all panelists. So who would like to pick this up first? Don't all rush at once. Nigel.
Thanks, Matthew. It's difficult. It's a little bit sort of a bit of a bottom-up and a top-down issue, in my opinion. I think the sector that I'm familiar with, obviously the airborne pollutants space, a lot of regulations have historically been developed to implement European policy, and therefore it's very much a sort of a top-down mechanistic sort of way of planning. And I think now that that's obviously potentially sort of lifting, we have an opportunity of seeing this from a different perspective, and with data becoming more, having more data sources available, technology changing, we can have a more sort of bottom-up approach to this as well. The thing I'd like to see from my side is the ability for, I think it starts with a policy level. It's realizing that the process of delivering, for example, air quality assessments, noise assessments, a lot of emission modeling is quite common. 80% of the data, I think from our analysis we've done, is pretty much identical. So if you can align regulations or policies or methodologies that then start to use interoperable data and share data, it not only creates an efficiency from the public purse, but it also enables you to start aligning, driving co-benefits. One measure or one project can deliver multiple benefits to different, to air, to noise, emissions. You have a more holistic, joined-up way of thinking. But I think that comes from having the right technical understanding and technical awareness at the policy level within government, in my experience, and being able to influence and shape policy thinking and approaches, rather than just viewing it purely as a discrete science issue. It's something says to me recently, we need to get data people who understand. I think it was a transport context. It's saying rather than transport people that understand data, we need to get data people that understand transports. And it's really sort of flipping the planning, flipping the thinking around for the way that we've traditionally done it.
I can see quite a few nods here from other panelists. Sarah, anything you wanted to?
Yeah, I think just echoing what Nigel said, they're obviously putting the data sort of back in the hands of the people that use it and understand it every day, and sort of making sure, again, making sure we've got the sort of standards in place, but and then there was a question there about sort of how to make sure that it's sort of shared safely as well, and just sort of making sure that there's licensing, the correct sort of level of licensing involved with these data sets as well, so that there's sort of clarity and understanding in what this data is going to be used for as well in the end. Obviously, if it's sort of the data is collected or captured for one purpose and then used for another way, then that's great. That may be a very innovative way of using that information, but just sort of making sure that that is sort of the right way to use it, I suppose.
Okay. Andrew, I could see you nodding there. Was something you wanted to add on this one?
Well, I just think that last point that Sarah made is absolutely key to a lot of the issues that we've run into, which is that we have found a lot of data and a lot of data sources that the data may have been collected for one purpose, but actually we're finding all sorts of other purposes that we could use the data for, insights that we can get from them, but they were gathered under particular consent regimes, which goes back to my point about data governance. So it is a very real and live problem that we've run into.
Okay, thank you. Kevin, conscious one of the sort of challenges I guess you threw down was, there's an assumption perhaps to think data is the answer, but if you don't know the question you're asking, that's you're at the wrong starting point. Again, sort of question to all the panel really is, what are your thoughts on it? Is there a danger sometimes? I mean, I guess Andrew, with your work, perhaps the question is a fairly straightforward one. You're trying to detect and understand the spread of COVID and the risks that COVID poses, so that the question is a very urgent sort of direct one. But do the panel have sort of views on the truth of Kevin's challenge, that sometimes maybe, whether it's public sector bodies or it could be private sector clients, don't fully understand the question they're trying to get an answer to when they turn to the data?
I could happily come in and just say that from the perspective of COVID, I think again, it's a completely spot on observation. And sort of interestingly, Matthew, you said, well, in the case of COVID, we've got a very direct sort of, objective. True. But actually what it turns out is that when policymakers ask questions, most of the time they're asking the wrong questions. And we have found out so much about what we don't know that we would like to have known in order to do the things that we need to do. And I can just give some very, very fast examples, but things like in terms of air monitoring, not air quality monitoring, but air monitoring COVID fragments in air. Things like we knew so little about the way that air circulates in things like trains. They're just the staple of our public transportation. We were designing policy, sometimes on fairly flawed assumptions. I think the question of aerosols people now understand has been, one of the core issues for understanding how COVID is transmitted. We knew so little about this at the beginning. But what we found is that in order to make sense of the information that we begin to find from the scientists, that we need to know all sorts of other things, and we didn't know those things either. So I think it's been an incredibly steep, interesting journey, but I hope the lessons learned take us into a better future.
Kevin, you were the panelist who sort of raised this question. You understand the questions. What, I
think it's born out of the idea that we've got certain monitors that monitor to a specific resolution. And so those monitors allow you to answer specific questions, on a temporal basis or on a spatial basis. Whereas when the question becomes a bit more detailed about how traffic, how they operate specifically, temporally and spatially, you need to have that type of resolution data being collected at the same scale in order to answer that question. And I suppose it also begs the idea when from low emission strategies, when there's certain aspects of a problem that's trying to be resolved, that brings up any number of other problems because of redistribution of traffic. And so the question changes, or the question you started out to try to answer brings up any numbers of other questions. Whereas what we should have said is, having that idea that, you right from the very beginning, that, you do realize what you're actually asking us to do will have these other implications. Therefore, we have to have the tools available to us in order to try to understand what those implications are. So we have that, I think it's that push-pull all the time in order to understand how we use data. And the temporally and spatially, how those data sources are used. And so that's why I always think that we can actually use this data probably better by understanding it in the first place. We can offer to sort of say, well, actually we can't answer that question because we haven't got the information available to us, but they still feel as though they can ask the question. So you say, well, I think from professional points of view, I think that's where we have this, that there's a little bit of a conflict, I think, all the time.
Conscious we're sadly nearly out of time, but Simon, just before I bring things to a conclusion, are there anything you want to add about it? Are there any of the questions that we've just talked through, or any wider thoughts you had?
No, I mean, I guess the main thing I would on a journey, and that will continue through 2021, and with or without the pandemic, I think it's catalyzed certain ways of working that we would wish to see continue, certainly as an organization. So I think we need to work as hard as possible to retain those upsides to the ways in which our activities have been constrained during the course of this year.
Yeah, I think that's very true, isn't it? I guess sadly, what we often have found in the past is that traumatic episodes, of which this is certainly one in a very major way, do sometimes give a push in advance to society and to the business community and the public sector to do things that should have taken a much longer time without that sort of grim push, as it were. So as you say, let's hope that that's what happens in this case. Thank you very much to all the panelists. Some really interesting and different perspectives there on one of the huge challenges, how we use data to understand both health threats and environmental threats and the link between the two of them. As we said at the beginning, there'll be a recording of this webinar, will be sent, I think, to all attendees as a link later this afternoon, so you can forward it to colleagues or sort of look at it again. This is the first in a series of 3 webinars, so we've got the next one's on the 14th of January, and that'll look at environmental data innovation and the broad green recovery agenda. And then the last of the 3 is on the 24th of February, and it'll look at the role of data in the government's ambitious and controversial, I guess, planning reform agenda, where there's a big opportunity, I think, for data to play a part in that. So thank you very much. And just in closing, may I wish you all a very relaxing and peaceful Christmas. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.